We can divorce if you want, but let me live with our son." After berating me extensively, John looked satisfied as he took a deep breath. As I pondered on how to retort, our son, who had been waiting in the background, stepped forward. "If you don't know, Dad, let me tell you. That person is..." Pointing at his father's mistress, our son spat out words that made me break into a cheeky smile. "My name is Jennifer. I turned 42 this year. Currently, I'm a freelance illustrator while doing housework. I've been married for 15 years and have a son who's in 8th grade this year. Ever since we got married, John has been jumping from job to job, not lasting very long. We mostly live off my income. To raise our son, a steady income is needed, so I've worked hard to make ends meet while also taking care of him. Balancing housework, child raising, and my job, I had to work from home. John often left home for sporadic short-term jobs, making it impossible for me to leave our child behind and work outside. At first, being a newbie to the freelance world was tough, but now, the results are evident, and I'm confident about my stable income and consistent work. Thanks to referrals from former clients, I've landed new projects. In these new assignments, I'm responsible for illustrating educational magazines and brochures. Now that David has grown up and I don't have to look after him as much as I used to, I not only work from home but also manage to go out for work a few times a week. Thus, the three of us live together harmoniously, but there's something that's been bothering me. It's about John. Seeing that I've been earning steadily, John doesn't seem eager to find a new job and has been quite aimless. I'm always worried if it's okay for him at 44 to be living like this. He rarely works full-time, so he should have some free time, but John doesn't help much with housework or child raising. It's been like this since we got married, so I've kinda given up on it. He doesn't seem to be interested in our son, David, who's now in those challenging teenage years, which annoys me. David may not be very talkative and seems distant, but there are times when he helps with the chores when I'm not looking. Maybe he's seen me juggling work and household chores since he was little, so he's the kind of boy who voluntarily offers to help. David has grown up so much, but John, on the other hand, doesn't seem to have matured at all. Lately, John's been coming home late more often, and I guess I've been holding on to some unease and frustration. It's only natural to be suspicious. Even on days when I don't think he's scheduled to work, he says he has to go for work reasons. But I can't imagine he's secretly job hunting without telling us. There are other things he does that make me suspicious. For the past few months, though John hasn't been looking after David much, he's become keen on picking him up and dropping him off at his basketball club. Even though David is just in 8th grade, given the dangers of today's world, our household rule is to always drop off and pick up. I've always been the one squeezing this into my work schedule, but lately, for some reason, John started offering to do it. I appreciate the help with the pickups and drop-offs, but something felt off. I happened to realize the nature of my suspicion by chance when I passed by the place David goes to. I decided to take a different route home for a change of pace after shopping. In front of the place David goes to, I saw John, who wasn't supposed to be there. He had said he'd be late tonight because of work out of town. John was chatting happily with a woman who looked like one of the staffs from the basketball facility in front of the building. I had a bad feeling, and as I stared at the two of them, the woman noticed me and tilted her head, calling out, "Excuse me, are you David's mom?" "Yes, my son always been in your care." "Thank you," I responded, nodding slightly awkwardly to the woman who was talking cutesy. Though I had seen her a few times during drop-offs and pickups, I didn't remember all the faces of the staff. I was wondering which duties she does here. Ignoring my husband who looked rigid and tense, I made small talk with her. The woman introduced herself as Jessica. Isn't it usual to introduce herself with not only name, but also what she's in charge of my child in such situations? Noticing my puzzled expression, my husband seemed to hurry to end their conversation. On the way home, we didn't speak, and it felt like he was purposely avoiding me. Even though he seemed to enjoy talking to Jessica so much, while walking beside me, he was deliberately looking down, avoiding eye contact. I could tell something was up. His late returns recently and his eagerness to do the drop-offs and pickups, combined with his strange behavior after being spotted, made me believe that woman, Jessica, had something to do with it. Is he having an affair with that slightly younger woman? Somewhere in my heart, I knew. I had sensed the change. Ever since he started doing the drop-offs and pickups, he had become noticeably distant from me. That day, when our son returned from the basketball club, I casually inquired about his father's behavior. However, the only response I got from him was a curt "and he was like I dunno." It seemed my son was pretty darn annoyed about his dad wanting to drive him to and from the facility every day. Chasing after our reluctant son and forcing him to there just didn't seem right. I've started to cast suspicious glances at him for some time now. And those suspicions were gonna be proven right soon enough. I was just passing by, so I thought I'd drop in. David, how are you feeling? Thank you for coming all this way, Jessica. Now, please have some coffee. Jessica, whom I had not suspected of being my husband's mistress, began to find excuses to visit our home more and more. She would mention our son now and then, but that was clearly just a pretext. She always appeared during the hours my husband was home, not me or my son. Watching the two of them conversing cheerfully in the living room, I was sure of John's infidelity. A month after I began to notice something odd about my husband's behavior, he started coming home later and later, sometimes leaving the house for a few days at a time. I'd subtly asked him what he was up to, as he had stealthily come home late the night before, when I pointed out that his body that had sunk into the sofa quivered. Jokingly, I was like, "At least spare me the cheating," and laughed it off, but John suddenly stood up and glared at me. "You just stick to your work. I'm taking care of David, so don't pry into it unnecessarily." Whether it was the way I asked or something else, he seemed irritated, and he left the living room with a sigh. I was furious to be told as if he was doing everything when he had left all the housework and David to me. "What's the matter, Mom?" David, who had been watching our petty quarrels and squabbles, unusually spoke up. "Oh, it's nothing. What about you, David? Why are you up at this hour?" Coming out of his room, David stared at me intently before slowly opening his mouth. Hesitantly, he told me about the female staff who he thought might be his father's mistress. According to David, Jessica would cling to him a lot at the facility. David, who found it utterly annoying, would ignore her, but he was frustrated that she would come to our house. I disliked it as well, so it was obvious that my son would be annoyed by someone from his basketball club imposing on our home. I was relieved to know that I was not the only one who disliked it, but the problem was far from solved. When I returned home from a client meeting, I could hear joyful conversation from the living room. It was the voices of John and Jessica. David was probably holed up in his room, as there was no sign of him joining the conversation. When I opened the door to the living room, both of them turned their eyes to me. John, as usual, looked uncomfortable, but Jessica smiled at me with complete confidence. "Welcome back, David's mom. I ran into John, so he invited me in." Somewhere along the line, Jessica had started addressing my husband by his name, and I had a deep-seated unease about it. "Oh, we meet often, don't we? Isn't it a busy time for you at work?" I asked with a hint of sarcasm. She was like, "Well, this is part of my job," with a smug face. "What's part of the job?" I felt like yelling at her for so boldly making herself at home. "It's just that this house feels so cozy. It looks like you don't clean it thoroughly, like it has a homely feel, you know? I mean it in a good way." Jessica, subtly pointing out the deficiencies in my housekeeping, had a sly grin on her face. "I'm sorry for the messy house. She's always been bad at housework. I wish she'd step up a bit more since she's always at home." My husband didn't rebut, but instead seemed to side with Jessica, chuckling along. Even though I work from home, I am somewhat self-conscious about not keeping up with housework. But if he'd be more proactive in helping with chores and childcare, it wouldn't be an issue. I couldn't understand why I was the only one being mocked and ridiculed. Unable to bear the tension in the room, I hastily left the living room for the bedroom, still holding my stuff. I was so frustrated, sad, and embarrassed. I feared that Jessica might eventually take over my place in the family. If she weren't associated with the basketball team my son goes to, I might have snapped back. But I worried about the repercussions for my son. Even after that, my husband and Jessica continued their dates, flaunting their relationship in front of me, who couldn't say a word. I'd hear from others that they often met outside, under the pretense of discussing my son's education. I decided to gather evidence during my husband's absences, and lo and behold, I found loads of evidence of his infidelity. Even though he always claimed we couldn't afford gifts for birthdays or our anniversary, I found receipts from motels, fancy restaurants, and high-end brand watches and jewelry in his coat pocket. I even found receipts from places he told me we couldn't afford to go. It hurt to think he'd go with his mistress but not his wife. Still, I kept my composure and continued collecting evidence of his affairs. The thought of divorce crossed my mind, but I wanted to hang in there at least until David graduated from high school. However, I vowed to gather as much evidence as possible so that, if the time comes, I'd be in a favorable position. I wondered where all the money he was spending on his mistress came from. Even if he put in all of his salary, it would be hard to keep up this charade. As I wandered around the house deep in thought, I suddenly remembered something and went pale. In our house, there's an account where we've been saving up for my son's college fund. I had this overwhelming bad feeling, and cold sweat ran down my back. I quickly checked transactions of that account. What was recorded in the account was evidence of substantial amounts being withdrawn several times over the past few months. I had created this savings account specifically to secure my son's education funds just in case. I hadn't checked it in a while and was shocked to find that the balance had decreased significantly. I had meticulously managed our credit card usage and monthly bills, but I hadn't been able to check this savings account monthly. The realization hit me hard, and I began to tremble. I tried hard to steady my shaking hands. The money he spent on his affair came from the savings I had put aside for our son. I didn't even care who he was having an affair with anymore. What I couldn't forgive was the fact that he was using the money saved for our child's future for his own selfish needs. His betrayal against me as his wife pales in comparison to the betrayal against our own son. I swallowed my boiling anger and decided to continue acting like everything was normal. I didn't want our son, who's at such an impressionable age, to catch on. I chose to keep all the problems and worries to myself, trying not to burden our son, who has been studying so hard. But the stress took a toll on me, and I started making small mistakes in my household chores and at work. At work, even Mrs. Smith, a client I had known for years, noticed my worn-out state. "Jennifer, you seem off lately. Don't overdo it at work. If there's anything bothering you, please let me know anytime." "Thank you, Mrs. Smith." I felt pathetic for making her worry, but her words did offer some comfort. While I was struggling, my husband seemed to be having a blast with his mistress, more than ever. Without my interference, he seemed more relaxed. Sooner or later, our son, David, would inevitably face the problems surrounding our family. David noticed my downtrodden demeanor and silently approached to help fold the laundry. "I kinda know what's going on." "Huh?" He was like, "Do whatever you wanna do, Mom. You don't have to worry about me." He took the folded laundry to the dresser. He's not much of a talker, but his thoughtful actions warmed my heart. And it made me even angrier at the traitor who touched the money I had saved for our precious son. There needed to be some sort of retribution for the traitor. First, I wondered if I should reach out to that person who told me they'd always be there to support me. I clenched my fists tightly and swore vengeance on my husband and his mistress. One evening, my husband suddenly informed me he'd be away for almost a week due to work. He claimed it was for a training program in another state, but I doubted that's the truth. The restaurant chain he's worked for only operated within our state and didn't have any locations or offices outside. When he took the job, the very same husband boasted that one of its perks was not having to relocate out of state. When my son and I heard this story, we responded, but deep down, we were both highly critical of John. My son casually said to my husband, "You know, I heard one of the staffs from my club gonna be off work for a week too." At this time of year? I don't know if she's going on a vacation, but that seems pretty unusual. I mean, it'd be tough to go on a week-long vacation unless you've got some cash. As we conversed in a nonchalant tone, my husband looked at us with a startled expression. Until then, he had been proudly talking about the intensity of the training he was going to attend, but he suddenly became silent and stared down. Glancing at him, I noticed he was anxiously looking at his smartphone. Ever since I became sure of my husband's infidelity, I've been keeping tabs on both him and Jessica. I even hired a private investigator, who informed me that Jessica, who's working at the basketball facility, is also taking a week off. I've known all along that my husband's business trip was just a cover for a romantic getaway. I could have caught him red-handed, but I had other plans. I've been planning something ever since I knew about my husband's intentions to travel with Jessica. Of course, I had no intention of proceeding without my son's consent, but now he was on board. On the day of their trip, I waved goodbye to my eager husband, and then my son and I began cleaning the house. Along with cleaning, with the help of some relatives who came over, we also started packing. Our plan was to move out while my husband was away and stay in somewhere else. Until we found a new home, we were gonna stay with some relatives for a bit. Upon hearing our situation, the relatives, angered by my husband's actions yet concerned for David, gladly offered us a room. Moreover, I ensured that my husband couldn't access our savings account by transferring all the remaining money to my personal account. While making preparations, I noticed my husband's belongings were left behind. I couldn't leave his stuff behind when vacating the house. After some thought, I decided to send his belongings to a particular place. After getting Mrs. Smith's consent, I handed over the boxes to the pickup service. Looking around the tidy house, my son and I shared a smile. A few days after we moved, I was startled by the sudden ringing of my phone while staying at my relative's place. Seeing the caller's name made me sigh involuntarily. Hello, Jennifer? Hey. What's up in the middle of the day? Actually, during my training, I ran out of money. Can you transfer a bit to my account? My husband, who called in a panic, was obviously lying and begging me for money. No wonder our savings account was empty. He couldn't withdraw any funds. He must have really been in a bind since he sounded much more desperate than usual. Was it because he didn't want to look bad in front of Jessica? I was utterly exasperated. When I declined, he almost sounded like he was about to cry. With a smirk, I was like, why don't you just use the account you always withdraw from? Isn't there still a lot left? After a moment of silence, he started yelling and was like, are you okay with me being broke? But I didn't indulge him. Instead, I goaded him further. Your training's gonna end soon anyway. You'll be fine even without money. Suddenly, in the background, the frantic voice of a woman could be heard. That's right, I had been waiting for this moment. Taken aback by Jessica's voice in the background, my husband hastily hung up. Now everything was in place. The next day, my son and I were headed to a specific location. A magnificent mansion with a well-maintained garden. Anyone could tell that the residents were wealthy. On cue, my son and I found my cheating husband and his mistress in a room. My terrified husband sat on the floor, apologizing to someone. That someone, with a stern look on her face, was Mrs. Smith, a longtime client of mine and currently the principal of a middle school. David, my son, goes to her school, and Mrs. Smith and I have built a close relationship over the years. We trust each other with our personal troubles. I'm really sorry for my husband's trouble. I should be the one apologizing. Because of my good-for-nothing daughter, all this happened. It's turned out Jessica, who was on a trip with my husband, was grilled by her parents for a package she received at home and had no choice but to return home immediately. Naturally, she told my husband, John, to come with her. Upon hearing Mrs. Smith's words, my husband started to shake in fear. Mrs. Smith had always been concerned about my deteriorating health after knowing about John's affair. When I finally confided in her about the affair and she found out that the mistress was her daughter, she was utterly devastated. But Mrs. Smith wanted to make amends for her daughter's actions and had been cooperating with me ever since. She deeply apologized me, pointing at the piles of boxes. She sternly reprimanded her daughter. You should be ashamed of yourself for always wanting what isn't yours. Your father and sisters were dumbfounded when they saw these packages yesterday. But Mom, it's a misunderstanding. And who would send so many packages to our house? Isn't this woman out of her mind? John, say something. Jessica said that, her voice shaking with tears, and tried to force John, who didn't say anything, to join her. However, I doubted John would come up with any decent excuse after I glared at him. Jessica, with a panicked look on her face, blurted out that she didn't know her mother worked with me. Jessica never wanted her strict mother to know about her affair with a married man. Mrs. Smith, being an educator, possesses a strict moral code and won't tolerate dishonest behavior. She probably wouldn't ever forgive her daughter's actions. However, I couldn't muster a shred of sympathy for Jessica. I'm gonna insist on apologize from you. I'll make sure my daughter pays for her sin, even if it takes her whole life. I'll ensure she fulfills her responsibility. You've got to be kidding me! Why is this happening to me? Ignoring the hysterical Jessica, I quietly glared at my silent husband standing next to her. Hey, don't you have something to say to me? As I sent a sharp glance alongside David, for some reason, he started berating me. Jessica is a wonderful person. She thinks about the children way more than you ever did. Jessica is domestic and doesn't act all high and mighty even though she earns more than me. You're a failure as a wife. Really? We can divorce if you want, but let me live with our son. I plan on raising him with Jessica. After vehemently berating me, my husband took a satisfying breath. While I was thinking of a retort, David, who had been standing behind me, stepped forward. She's not a regular staff there, just an internship at the club. And don't you ever try to get all chummy with me again. Always flirting with men, it's disgusting. Just as my son said, Jessica hadn't been officially hired there. My husband always believed she was passionate and experienced in the industry involving students' education or activities, which was just laughable. Well, it seemed they both had their secrets. Looking at the stunned Jessica, I decided to give her a piece of advice before I go. Did you know that I pay for the rent, the living expenses, and even David's tuition fees? This man, John, has been working odd jobs for years. You think he's okay? Hey. That's. John, with a face drained of color, tries to interject, but it was already too late. Jessica was so shocked by the revelation that she collapsed on the spot, motionless. From what I could tell, John had been acting as if he had plenty of money to spare. He must have been hiding the fact that I was the breadwinner of the family to save face. In Jessica's eyes, I seemed like a lazy bum who neither worked nor took care of household chores properly. Mrs. Smith was left devastated, facing the harsh reality presented to her by my husband and Jessica. After David and I happily came home, it seemed John was kicked out of Mrs. Smith's house, looking defeated with Jessica and a load of stuffs. Months have flown by since the move. On Mrs. Smith's advice, I decided to leave my divorce process to a competent lawyer. Thanks to having a professional handle things, all the complicated procedures went smoothly, and I've been relieved. I heard that the savings I had set aside for David's education could also be added to the claim as a child support. As for Jessica, rumors spread quickly at the basketball club about her having an affair with a student's parent, and she seems to have been kicked out. Losing her job, Jessica sought help from her parents, but Mrs. Smith didn't seem willing to help. Cut off from all support from her family, I heard she's now lost and confused. Jessica, despising a man without money, spat out words of disdain and abandoned John. John, who has no stable income, keeps trying to reconcile in every way possible, but neither David nor I are gonna agree that. Mrs. Smith feels terribly guilty for her daughter ruining a family. I held the downcast principal's hand and was like, let's keep working together. I'm really grateful for the principal, thanks to whom I've got a new job. Work has been going smoothly, and life with just David and me is filled with hope. The job you do, Mom, is really amazing. You're the mom I'm proud of. Looking at a magazine featuring my illustrations, David smiled joyfully. Touched by David's casual words, I, who was working on my laptop, discreetly wiped a tear from my eye. I want to keep pursuing my career as an illustrator, but above all, I want to work even harder for my precious David.